Genevieve. You're on, Rena.
Okay. Okay, I can't see anybody, so I assume you're all out there, and at the end, we'll have our discussion and we'll go to gallery view and I'll be able to see everybody. So that will be very nice. Usually I can see at least a few people, but it's not quite working that way tonight, but that's okay. So I hope you can all see my screen. If there's any problem, please let me or Sarah know.
Here's the person.
Can everybody see my PowerPoint, my screen? You see these nice picture of these suffragists?
Can you go down, maybe?
Okay, everybody sees it? Okay.
You know,
so I'm
the only thing I see is the picture that says the women's movement gender rights.
Yeah, that's all you should see.
Can't we?
I hope you see me too.
Well, that's the best part.
Okay, okay. All right, good. So as long as you can see me and you can see the PowerPoint, that's,
Got it.
yeah, you're in the right place. Okay, so it's great to be with you again this evening. And tonight we're turning to, last week we talked about the labor movement and economic justice. Tonight we're turning to the women's movement, gender rights. And we're going to be talking about both first wave feminism, that is the feminism of the mid 19th century to the time of the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, and then what we often refer to as second wave feminism of the 1960s and 1970s. So we'll be talking about some key Jewish women who were involved in both phases of the movement. I think, you know, this again, just like all of our other topics in this course, this is a very timely topic because I think we're all thinking about women's issues recently, with Kamala Harris being the first woman vice president, and also with Joe Biden's appointment of women to some very top positions, often for the first time. So Janet Yellen is the first woman secretary of the Treasury, for example, and Avril Haines is the first director of the first woman to serve as director of national intelligence. So, so there have been many firsts in the Biden administration, and also a good deal of gender balance in the cabinet as a whole. So, you know, we're thinking a lot about women and the fact that Kamala Harris is a very important symbolic change in the way things have been done in this country, and has been a real role model for many, many people, as was pointed out at the time of the inauguration. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about some Jewish women who played an important roles in the women's movement in the very early stages, and then in the 1960s and 1970s, which we're more familiar with. I am not planning to discuss the Jewish feminist movement in my talk tonight, but if you have any questions about that, I know that Sarah had said that there was some interest in the Jewish feminist movement. We can certainly raise that during the discussion portion of our evening. And I myself was, I played a personal role in the Jewish feminist movement of the 1970s, so I'll be glad to share that with you if you like. I did want to mention at the beginning that Jewish women did play an important role in the women's movement, both in the early stages and later. And some historians have tried to figure out why it was that Jewish women were quite prominent. They weren't quite as prominent in the very early stages, but there were a few figures, and we'll talk about some of them tonight, who did play a very important role. But later on in the 1960s and 1970s, as we all know, Jewish women did play a they were quite prominent in the movement. And Betty Friedan was asked why she thought so many Jewish women were drawn into the leadership and membership of the women's movement. And she said she thought that one reason was that Jewish women tended to be very well educated, but then they were often, at least in the 1950s, and that changed later on, but in the 1950s, they were often raised to feel that their role in the home was the most important role that they could play. And that, of course, is a very important vocation for Jewish women, but she felt that there was sort of a gap between their educational level and their career expectations at that point. And so that was her theory as to why so many Jewish women felt that they had to fight for equal rights. Another reason that the historian Joyce Antler has mentioned is that Jewish women had a long experience with activism in the civil rights movement and in movements for nuclear disarmament, et cetera, in the 1950s and 1960s. So by the time, and of course, many Jewish women were involved in the progressive movement even earlier than that. And in the labor movement that we talked about last week, so that by the time they got to the 1960s and 1970s, they already had quite a bit of experience in political activism. So that's one thing to think about as we talk about some of these women, that there really was a background to their involvement in the women's movement. Also, one of the things that comes up a lot when we think about Jewish women in the women's movement is that they were very eager to be part of this movement and to work with their Christian sisters in all of these movements, and very often had excellent working relationships with non-Jewish women. But there was also some tension sometimes, because the women who were not Jewish in the women's movement often didn't give Jewish women enough credit for their work. Sometimes they did, but sometimes they didn't. And also, there were some cases of Christian women in the women's movement harboring some anti-Semitism that Jewish women had to struggle against. And of course, we see that today as well in the women's movement today, where there are some anti-Semitic views, there are some anti-Zionist views. And so that, what we're seeing today, is not new. That happened from the very beginning. And sometimes it was a little difficult for Jewish women to break into the women's movement. And they sometimes were disappointed that their Christian co-workers in the movement did not defend Jewish rights strongly enough, and sometimes harbored some anti-Jewish opinions. We could talk more about that a little bit later, but again, it's something that is not completely new. So sometimes Jewish women in the women's movement found that they were struggling for women's rights, but then they also had to defend themselves as Jews, and often formed their own Jewish women's organizations. So the National Council of Jewish Women was formed in 1893, in large part because Jewish women felt that they needed their own forum. And as much as they were fighting for women's equality in general, that they felt they needed a Jewish women's group. So those are just a few introductory remarks. I wanted to talk about one of the early pioneers. My screen does not seem to be moving, and I don't know why. Just one moment. Oh, there we go. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here's a pioneer, Ernestine Rose, she, you may have heard about her. She's was born in Poland, Russian Poland. She's the daughter of a rabbi, and she had said of her childhood, "I was a rebel at the age of 5." She was an only child, and as a result received a very good Jewish education, which was not common for girls at that time. But as the daughter of a rabbi, she got a good Hebraic education. But also, as was common at the time, her father decided that he was going to marry her off at a very young age. And she actually refused to marry the person that her father had picked out for her. And she brought her case to the civil courts, which was very unusual at the time, and she won her case. So you could see what an activist she was from a very early age. She recovered the inheritance that her father had promised to her, to the person, to the man that he had chosen for her, and she returned most of it to her father, but she took what she needed to leave Poland, and she left home at age 17. Came to Prussia, where she fought for her rights as a Polish Jew to stay in Prussia, because that was often difficult at that time. And then went to England. She traveled around quite a bit, went to England and met Robert Owen, who was a utopian socialist. And Owen had a very big impact on her and on all of her later work. She married William Ella Rose, who was also an Owenite socialist. And he was a very big supporter of her work, both emotionally and financially. And she became known for her many speeches. She spoke all over in Europe, and then eventually they came to the United States. In about 1836, they came to New York State. And she, because of her many, she learned English in England and became very fluent, as you'll see when we look at an excerpt from her speech. She was known as the Queen of the Platform because of her many speeches on behalf of abolitionism, women's rights, religious freedom, and public education. So this was a time, as you know, when there weren't many women who were speaking out, but Ernestine Rose was one of those people and a real pioneer in that way. It was very common, as you know, at that time for the abolitionists and the women's rights advocates to work together. And Ernestine Rose often spoke about both causes together and felt that they were intertwined. And you'll see that in the excerpt that I've chosen to share with you. So she worked with many of the leaders of the abolitionists and the women's rights movements who were very well known: Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass. All of these names very, very well known to us. So in fact, when I went to the Jewish, the Women's Rights Museum in Seneca Falls, New York, a lot of these women are, of course, mentioned, but Ernestine Rose was not mentioned. And I think I saw only one small reference to her, and I brought it to the attention of the museum folks and said that she really should get the credit because she was acknowledged at the time. Susan B. Anthony felt that Ernestine Rose toured with Susan B. Anthony, and Anthony said that Rose really should deserve to be credited with leadership in the women's movement of that time. She lobbied in New York State to get passage of a married women's property law, which enabled women to retain their own property after marriage. That was not common at the time, and New York State was a pioneer in that area, and then that was extended to other states as well. Ernestine Rose, even though she was very other-directed, did speak out and defend Jews on several occasions when they were threatened with anti-Semitism. She was not an observant person. She left her Jewish observance behind when she left Poland, but she never considered conversion to Christianity. And she, as I said, did speak out on behalf of Jewish rights. So for example, when the editor of a Boston newspaper attacked Jews, Ernestine Rose wrote a very strong critique of anti-Semitism and defended Jewish contributions to a secular and religious culture. So she was a delegate to many of the national and the national, state, and local women's rights conventions. She actually raised the very important women's rights resolution at the first Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. So she was very prominent, and her speeches are stirring. So I've included a couple of excerpts from her speeches. As you can see, she had a tremendous command of the language. And these excerpts will give you a sense of how she combined her struggle for abolitionism and for women's rights. So she said, even here in this far-famed land of freedom, woman has yet to plead for her rights, nay, for her life. For what is life without liberty? And what is liberty without equality of rights? What right has man to deprive woman of the rights and privileges he claims for himself? And why, in the name of reason and justice, should she not have the same rights? In the laws of the land, she has no rights. In government, she has no voice. She is taxed without being represented. From the cradle to the grave, she is subject to the power and control of man. Here's another excerpt from another one of her speeches. She said, I go for emancipation of all kinds, white and black, man and woman. Humanity's children are, in my estimation, all one in the same family, inheriting the same earth. Therefore, there should be no slaves of any kind among them. The slaves of the South are not the only people that are in bondage. All women are excluded from the enjoyment of that liberty, which your Declaration of Independence asserts to be the inalienable right of all. The same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that pertains to man pertains to women also. For what is life without liberty? Which of you here before me would not willingly risk his or her life if in danger of being made a slave? Emancipation from every kind of bondage is my principle. I go for the recognition of human rights without distinction of sect, party, sex, or color. So very, very powerful words. I'd like to go on to talk about another leading figure on behalf of women's rights a little bit later period. So Hannah Greenbaum Solomon, give you her dates here for a moment. There are her dates. So she's definitely a later figure. She is best known, those of you who are members of the National Council of Jewish Women, Hannah Greenbaum Solomon is best known as the first president, founder and first president of the National Council of Jewish Women. But she was very important also as a progressive reformer, especially in the Chicago area. So she and her sister Henrietta were the first Jewish members of the Chicago Women's Club. Some of you may know about the Women's Club movement. This was an early precursor of the women's movement. It was something much broader than the Jewish community. In the United States, middle-class women would join clubs and they would talk about intellectual things. They were kind of study circles. And eventually the clubs began to become involved in all kinds of areas of progressive reform. So these women were not challenging traditional ideas about women's roles in the family. Most of them considered to be their roles in the family to be their most important work. But they began to branch out and to say that they were going to take their domestic skills and extend them into the society at large and to work on behalf of a whole variety of progressive causes. So they tried to work on sanitation, they worked on immigrant rights, they worked on helping the poor, and tenement house reform and all of these other areas. And they saw that as an extension of their roles within the family and their nurturing roles. So they became reformers in many ways. Henrietta and her sister were the first Jewish members of the Chicago Women's Club. So they were able to break into a sphere that had previously been not friendly to Jews. So her family was a very prominent family. Her relatives had founded all 5 of Chicago's original Reform synagogues. She and her family belonged to Temple Sinai, which was a very prominent synagogue, Reform synagogue in Chicago. And the rabbi was Emil Hirsch, who was also a very prominent reformer and a spokesman for social justice. And I think that's where Hannah Greenbaum Solomon got her ideas about social reform, really from Emil Hirsch, who was a very great orator and inspired many people. She became involved in helping immigrants in the Chicago area as I mentioned, in sanitation issues. They were very concerned about Chicago's waste disposal system. And she went around, often in white dresses, which people found very amusing, to work on various aspects of urban sanitation. Remember, this is a time of tremendous urbanization and and there was a great push on the part of progressive reformers to create a healthier environment for the people who lived in urban areas. But as I said, one of her main contributions was as the founder of the National Council of Jewish Women, which was founded as part of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Because she felt it was very important, she organized the Jewish women as part of the larger Parliament of Religions in the Chicago World's Fair. She was invited by a Christian friend of hers to do that. And the National Council grew out of that, and it became a very important organization for middle-class Jewish women to, first of all, study about Judaism, and then again to extend what they were doing into social reform. And you know that the National Council has remained a very important and influential organization to this day. But the Hannah Greenbaum Solomon was also known for her suffrage work. She was a big advocate for suffrage. It's interesting that the National Council of Jewish Women as an organization did not endorse suffrage, at least not then, not till later. And that's because there were a number of people there were people who supported suffrage who were part of the National Council, and there were people who didn't, and it was a kind of controversial issue. And so the organization itself did not take a stand on behalf of suffrage early on, but Hannah Solomon did, and so did some other women who were very associated with the National Council of Jewish Women, like Sadie American. So in this excerpt from Hannah Greenbaum Solomon's memoir, I'll show you in just a moment. Her memoir is called Fabric of My Life. And in this section of the memoir, she talks about why she supported suffrage. She says, the fight for suffrage constitutes a long and interesting chapter. Even without the ballot, the influence of women had been a factor in the enactment of laws that aided women and children. But not until we could vote could our strength be exerted to the fullest. The earliest crusaders had secured the right for women to hold joint guardianship of their children. Before that time, in case of a divorce, decisions were entirely the father's prerogative, with the mother having no claims in relation to her offspring. A married woman could not inherit property from her parents. It all belonged to her husband. She could find no employment except as a teacher or a servant, and she had little opportunity for higher education. Now these injustices had become things of the past, and women were free to direct their attention and energy to obtaining suffrage. So this became an important cause for her, and she felt it was very important for both for middle-class women and for working-class women who needed the vote in order to gain better conditions in the labor movement. Interestingly, Hannah Greenbaum Solomon and Maud Nathan, who we're going to talk about next, were the only Jewish women who really played a role in the suffrage movement on the international level. So she was quite well known in her time, and she felt it was very important for Jewish women to have their own organization that is as illustrated by her work with the National Council of Jewish Women. But she also felt that Jewish women should branch out and should partner with their Christian sisters on behalf of suffrage and other causes. Okay, we're going to go on to talk about another very famous, probably the most famous Jewish suffragist, Maud Nathan. You may have heard about her. She's wearing one of her famous gowns. She would often wear an elegant gown when she spoke on behalf of suffrage, because she wanted to counter the stereotypes of suffragists who often wore clothing that was considered not as feminine at the time. And so she wanted to counter that image. I'll tell you, I'll read a little section from her memoir to you where she describes a kind of amusing incident about that. But she felt she had started her life as a society lady, and she felt it was very important to dress in this way so that she could, kind of shatter stereotypes about suffragists. So she was the descendant of a prominent New York Sephardic family. She was related to many prominent Sephardim in American Jewish history. Her great grandfather was Gershom Mendes Seixas, who was the Chazan at Shearith Israel, the Sephardic congregation. She was also related to Emma Lazarus, the poet, and her cousin was the Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo. So like Hannah Greenbaum Solomon, she was very well connected. And hers was a Sephardic family in New York, and she was throughout her life associated with Shearith Israel congregation, which was the first synagogue, first congregation established here in colonial America in New York. And she was always connected with the synagogue. She spoke at the synagogue at a time, again, when it was not common for women to be in the bima. And she was the first president of the, she was president of the Shearith Israel Sisterhood. So she was always very involved in the congregational life. She married her much older cousin, Frederick Nathan, and as I said, started her life her married life as a society wife. She did charity work, but she was really kind of hosting parties and all of that. Apparently, she was a very lively person. But after the tragic death of her only daughter at age 8, which was obviously a terrible blow for her, she began to get involved in reform activities. And she was inspired by Josephine Shaw Lowell, who was an important women reformer at the time. Josephine Shaw Lowell was the head of the New York Consumers League. The Consumers League was a very interesting organization because what they were trying to do was to get consumers, who were mostly middle and upper class people, involved in working on behalf of the working people in factories, sweatshops, and department stores, which were beginning to be important at that time. So what they were trying to do is something similar to what we do today. In other words, to sensitize, to raise the awareness of consumers to what was happening to the conditions of working people in these various venues, and to get consumers to only buy products that were produced in factories or in shops with better conditions. So the Consumers League would put out these white labels. They would identify certain factories and stores as white label factories and stores, and try to encourage consumers to patronize those stores and to buy those products as a way of advocating and pushing for better conditions for working people. So that was sort of Maud Nathan's entree into social reform. She became involved with the Consumers League and eventually became president of the League and served as president from 1897 to 1927. And through that, she started to learn more, coming from a rather comfortable background herself. She began to learn more about the issues facing women of all classes, and felt that suffrage was the way to provide support for women, middle-class women, and also for working women, and that was the best way to do it, that it was really important that they get the vote so that they could have more power. So Maud Nathan became the first vice president of New York's Equal Suffrage League, and she was known for, as you can see, Melissa Clapper called her the most famous American Jewish suffragist. But she was known for her interesting techniques. She would go around, there were cars at that time, so she would go around in open air cars and advocate for suffrage. She would give, somehow they were able to have these kind of like posters, and the posters were able to be rotated through, and she would use these kind of rotating posters to speak on behalf of suffrage. She had a very interesting technique. I don't know if I would recommend it, but she would take suffrage literature and wrap it around coins, and then throw the coins out to people, and that was a way of getting their attention and getting them to read the literature. So she had some very interesting techniques. And as I said, she was known for wearing fancy gowns to suffrage rallies as a way of getting attention and also countering stereotypes. So I told you I would read a little section from her memoir. She had her memoir is called Once Upon a Time and Today. And at one point, she talked about a meeting of, it was actually a hearing of suffragists and anti-suffragists in the state assembly in the New York State Assembly in Albany. And she said that the suffrage delegation was given one side of the assembly and the anti-suffragists were on the other side. And she says, we sat glaring at each other. And then she wrote this, which is kind of an amusing story. She said, I wore my most becoming gown and my most fetching hat. The doorkeeper gave me one look and directed me to the anti-side of the chamber. I was amused to find that my carefully selected costume had landed me in the wrong camp. I at once recognized the mistake and joined my fellow delegates on the other side of the chamber. Presently, the chair next to me was taken by Miss G, a well-known that is an anti-suffragist. She was wearing her usual mannish tailor-made costume, high stiff collar, shirt front, four-in-hand tie, coat of masculine cut, and dark derby hat. She looked about and saw herself surrounded by her antagonists, her friends sitting opposite. She jumped up, exclaiming, that man at the door sent me to the wrong side of the hall, and turning to me, she said, why didn't you tell me? I realized how the mistake had been made, but there was nothing for me to say except, I suppose you had been converted overnight. I wonder whether that doorkeeper at the Capitol has progressed beyond such traditional association of ideas. So, so this is a, just an example of this very spirited woman. It's interesting that in her own family, there were differences of opinion. She supported suffrage. She was a strong supporter, but her brothers opposed it. And her sister, Annie Nathan Meyer, who was very well known as the founder of Barnard College, was one of the most outspoken antis. So you have this battle of the sisters, and they often did speak against each other, where Annie Nathan Meyer, who you would expect to have been a supporter of suffrage because she was certainly a supporter of women's higher education, was a very prominent anti. And Maud Nathan was a very, very well-known suffragist, as I've said, probably the best-known Jewish suffragist. So this was a bit of a family feud. Maud Nathan also spoke a lot about, like Hannah Greenbaum Solomon, she was very connected to the Jewish community, unlike Ernestine Rose, who really separated herself from the Jewish community. But both of these women Hannah Greenbaum Solomon and Maud Nathan, were very connected to the Jewish community. And Maud Nathan often spoke at synagogue gatherings and at other Jewish gatherings. And whenever she did, she often used the argument that Jewish women and men should support suffrage. Jewish women should, because there were plenty of examples in the Bible of prominent Jewish women, and she often talked about them, people like Deborah, etc. And she also said that our Jewish tradition, this is something we talked about in our first class, that our Jewish tradition really mandates that we get involved in social justice kinds of causes. And she often would mention prophets like Isaiah in her speeches to Jewish audiences. And then she also would use the argument with, when she was speaking to a Jewish audience, and say, as people who have suffered persecution, we of all people should understand the need to provide provide rights for all people, and to fight for rights for all people. So, for example, at a rally in Philadelphia, she spoke at a rally at the Arch Street Theater in Philadelphia in November 1915. And she said that Jewish men should support the cause of women's suffrage because Jews had long been persecuted and had gained freedom and opportunity in America, and now they should provide these rights for women. And in a 1917 letter to New York rabbis, she connected suffrage, made a connection between suffrage and the Eshet Chayil image. We know about the Eshet Chayil, or the woman of valor, the section from Proverbs that is traditionally recited by Jewish husbands to their wives on Friday evenings. And Maud Nathan held this up as an image of respect for women, and said that we as Jews should support suffrage as a result. She was also a very proud American. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. So she really functioned well in both spheres. Joyce Antler has said about Maud Nathan that she, quote, deliberately left what she considered to be the narrow communal circles of Jewish life to enter broader, non-sectarian venues of philanthropy, communal service, and feminism. She came to these arenas as a confident, proudly identified Jewish woman with a coherent set of spiritual values that she applied explicitly to her public activism. So she's one of the people who got involved. She was involved in the Jewish community. She was involved with the National Council of Jewish Women. But she also was very involved with general causes, including suffrage, but always brought her experience as a Jewish woman to bear on her social justice work. So here's a quote from her memoir, where she talks about why she felt it was so important to support suffrage, particularly on behalf of working women. She said, "My experiences in endeavoring to get legislation enacted for the better protection of working girls had strengthened my convictions that until women obtained the franchise, their influence with members of the legislature would continue to be a negligible quantity. So more and more of my time was given to work which I felt would hasten the day when women would have on equal terms with men the privileges, the rights, the burdens and responsibilities too of the franchise." And here's another quote from her memoir, where she says, "It has been many years now since the yellow banner with the legend Votes for Women has been seen fluttering everywhere. The younger generation has almost forgotten what it looked like. The unborn generation will never know it existed. But to us who waved it together with our beloved stars and stripes, who marched under it, who carried it with us across continents and oceans, who wore its emblem on our breasts, it has become associated in our minds with an undying loyalty to a cause." This is kind of an interesting quote. When I read it, I think about how young women today, especially in the Jewish community, with which I'm most familiar, don't really know, as she says, the younger generation has almost forgotten what it looked like, don't really know about all the struggles that went into the rights that Jewish women take for granted today. Right to be rabbis and cantors and synagogue presidents and all of these other roles that women take on today. This is something that the younger generation kind of takes for granted, but they were very hard won, as we all know. So it is interesting what happens as time moves on and with progress, and that people don't necessarily realize or appreciate the struggles that went on before. Here's a picture of a suffrage rally. In fact, President Wilson said that he was motivated to support suffrage. He was much more hesitant about it beforehand, but there is a story, and actually Maud Nathan tells the story in her memoir, that she says that President Wilson said, according to her, that he was motivated or inspired to support suffrage because he had met Maud Nathan, and he was very impressed with the way she spoke, and she was actually asking him to appear as a speaker for the consumers organization, but when he heard her, that he felt that it was important to support women's suffrage. So she seems to have played a role in his later support for the cause. I just want to say something about support for suffrage in the larger women's movement. It is interesting that there was strong support for suffrage in many immigrant neighborhoods among both men and women. And the women were out kind of especially in immigrant neighborhoods. We have quite a bit of research on this that a number of historians have done over the last few decades. And they found that Jewish women in immigrant neighborhoods were pushing for the passage of the 19th Amendment, but that there was also strong support among the men. And that's interesting and important. And there was support not only in the immigrant community, but also in the so-called uptown community. So Rabbi Stephen Wise, who we mentioned last week, was a very strong supporter of suffrage among other causes. And his essay, he wrote a prominent essay in 1915 called Woman and Democracy, where he made some very interesting and very progressive arguments. He argued that working women needed a say in conditions in the factories where they were working, and so they needed the vote. He said that women had demonstrated through their leadership in the suffrage movement that they could take on citizenship responsibilities. And he said that this was a very interesting one. He said that wifehood and motherhood were not adequate as lifelong ambitions for women, and that they should no longer see themselves only in relation to men, that they have to shape their own lives and futures, which was quite interesting and quite, ahead of his time for 1915. So now we're going to move on to second wave feminism, which of course built on first wave feminism. Betty Friedan is very well known to all of you, I'm sure. And she, of course, is one of the most prominent people associated with second wave feminism, and spoke a lot about what led her to feminism. And part of what motivated her was her childhood in Peoria, Illinois, where she as a Jewish person, her family is a Jewish family, were in a definite minority, and she felt a lot of social exclusion that she talked about later in her life. That even though her parents were prominent in the city, her father owned a jewelry store, he was well known, he was active in the Jewish community, was also well known beyond the Jewish community. That she felt a lot of social exclusion when she was growing up, wasn't accepted into a sorority, and felt that was because of her. She felt it was because of her Jewishness, and she thought that was something that affected her later on, and may have given her a sense of injustice that she felt had to be rectified. So she often talked about those experiences. She did have a Jewish background. She went to Sunday school. She was confirmed in a Reform synagogue instead of bat mitzvah. And she tells an interesting story that before her confirmation, a month before her confirmation, she had told the rabbi that she didn't believe in God anymore. And he said, don't say anything until after the ceremony. So she said that, she had a Jewish background. They did have seders that she remembered. And she said, though, that she was raised in a rather kind of assimilated Jewish home, even though she had some Jewish education. And that Jewish religion was not stressed so much. But later in her life, she did come to a greater appreciation for some of the religious aspects of Judaism. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But she attended Smith College, majored in psychology, and she, it was really because of her connection with Smith College, is what led to her writing of her very famous book, The Feminine Mystique. Before she married, she had actually worked for labor union publications. And so she had worked in journalism. So many people think that this was something that that her work on behalf of some of the publications were actually radical publications, that she already had some political training and certainly some training in journalism before she came to the women's movement. So there were a variety of factors that led to her involvement in the women's movement. But the immediate catalyst was that in 1957, she did a survey of some of her Smith College graduates and asked them about their lives, and found that many of them said that they were feeling dissatisfied with their lives as middle-class housewives, and she was feeling some of that as well. She was working, writing for women's magazines, but basically was home caring for her 3 children, and felt this sense of malaise. And of course, the Feminine Mystique is about what she called the problem that has no name, that many women were feeling unfulfilled in their roles as middle-class housewives. And what Betty Friedan demonstrated in her book, The Feminine Mystique, was that this was a systemic problem. This wasn't just what individual women were facing, but that this was something that was inherent in the role, and that these well-educated women were feeling unfulfilled in what they were doing. Not to say that they, weren't enjoying their roles as wives and mothers, but that they felt that many of them felt it wasn't enough for them. After the great success of The Feminine Mystique, it became a bestseller. It was translated into many languages, sold more than 2 million copies. Betty Friedan went into political organizing. She was the founder of the National Organization for Women in 1966 and served as its first president. She founded the National Abortion Rights Action League, the Women's Strike for Equality, and organized with Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm the National Women's Political Caucus, which was the main goal was to try to get more women to run for and win public office. So all of the gains that I talked about at the beginning, in some ways we can trace back to some of these activities of Betty Friedan and some of the other women in the 1970s. She wrote many, many books beyond The Feminine Mystique. Life So Far is her memoir, Writings on the Women's Movement, The Second Stage, which was about how she felt the women's movement should progress beyond struggling for equal access to changing the workplace and the family so that men and women could share in that, and to create really a new society in many ways. The Fountain of Age, about aging, which was a very powerful book. So she wrote many, many books which were widely read. And she attended the International Women's Conferences of the United Nations, where she talked about how she faced some of the anti-Zionism that I talked about at the beginning, and felt that she had to stand up as a Jew, and felt that that was a turning point for her in many ways. This was true of Bella Abzug as well, which we'll talk about in a moment, where Betty Friedan, and Bella Abzug's Jewish identity was very strong throughout her life and career. But for Betty Friedan, she had become, much more of a universalist in many ways. But she found that those experiences with anti-Zionism in the international women's movement kind of compelled her to speak out more about her Jewishness. She did say, very interesting, she had helped to organize the Women's Strike for Equality in August of 1970, which was a major demonstration of women. And at that event, Betty Friedan said the following: "Down through the generations in history, my ancestors prayed, 'I thank thee, Lord, I was not created a woman.' And from this day forward, I trust that women all over the world will be able to say, 'I thank thee, Lord, I was created a woman.'" So here's an example. Of course, Friedan here is referring to the Birchot HaShachar, the morning blessings, where there is a blessing thanking God for, men thank God for not having made them a woman. Today we say, in many congregations, we say, "Sha'asani kirtzono," who made me according to his will. But Friedan here is drawing on her Jewish background, in this case, kind of opposing the traditional view, but you can see that she, spoke about her Jewishness in connection with her feminism. Here's a very nice selection from her memoir, where she says, "My Jewish existential conscience always seems to drive me to use my life to make the world better, to protest and march against injustice. I wouldn't be the first Jewish thinker in a long line of prophets and social theorists, up until now mostly male, to have applied that existential imperative, which may or may not stem from those tablets Moses brought down from the mountain, or our personal experience of injustice as Jews, to the widest possible class of humanity of which we are a part." So here she's talking about how her Jewishness, she thinks, did play an important role in driving her to fight for justice. And there's a very interesting article, an interview that was done with Betty Friedan in the magazine Tikkun in January, February 1988, where she speaks about her Jewishness and how that may have influenced her in her social justice work and her work on behalf of feminism. And she talks about growing up in Peoria and the sense of social exclusion, her experience of anti-Semitism. She does say that it was, for a long time, she didn't connect so much to her Jewishness because she was raised to be more secular. But that, as I mentioned in these conferences, the International Women's Conferences, she felt she was up against women who began to label Zionism as racism. And she felt she had to begin to stand up as a Jewish woman. And she later in the 1970s and in 1980s, said the following: "My feminism has led me to an unabashed sense of the unity of spirit and political values." And she goes on to talk about how when she's in California, she's part of a Jewish study group. And she says, "I have a sense of wanting to know more about the mystery of being Jewish." And then she goes on to say how proud she is of the Jewish feminist movement that later developed, and that there are now women rabbis. And she says, "I love what the new young women rabbis are imparting to Judaism and bringing into this field. Definitions based on female experience, not just male experience." So, she's one of the people who, always had a sense of her Jewishness, felt that it was important in her feminism, but later on came to a kind of renewed appreciation of her Jewish background. I feel like I have to talk about Bella Abzug, well known to many of us. Bella came from a very different background in a sense than Betty Friedan, because it was a very strong, strongly connected Jewish, her family was very strongly connected to the Jewish community. She was born in New York. She had a very strong Jewish education. She was active in the Hashomer Hatzair, the labor Zionist group, raised money for Hashomer Hatzair. And her grandfather, her maternal grandfather, had a big influence on her. He took her to synagogue. She often talked about that in a number of pieces that I've seen of hers. She learned Hebrew in the prayers, and he was very proud of her and her proficiency with the prayers. She went to Talmud Torah school. And as I said, she would stand on subway cars and make speeches to raise money for Hashomer Hatzair. She had thought about going to work on a kibbutz and live on a kibbutz, which she did not do, but she felt she got a lot of her early political training through her Zionist work. She was very close to her father, and her father died very young, when she was very young too. She was only 13 when he died. And that's when she felt that she had to say Kaddish for him. So that was an early experience of both connecting to her Jewishness and speaking out on her rights as a girl. Her mother had to support the family, and as a very strong woman, she was an important role model for Bella. Bella went to Hebrew high school. She taught Hebrew and Jewish history at synagogues. And she decided she wanted to become a lawyer to help the poor, which her mother supported her in that goal. And at Hunter College, she was very involved she was the president of the student body, and she was involved in many political activities at the time. The Spanish Civil War, the rise of Nazism were the big issues of the time. And she got a lot of early political training. As a lawyer, she went to Columbia University Law School, which did admit women at the time, but there were only 9 women students in her class, and joined a labor law firm. So she worked in labor law, but eventually became more involved in defending civil liberties, especially during the McCarthy era. She became involved in peace efforts, anti-Vietnam War, and especially was involved in the cause to ban nuclear testing. She often talked about her father and the influence that her father had on her. She said that her father, try to find the story, that he had put out a sign. He had a butcher shop, and he had put out a sign in his butcher shop that said, no, that was against war. And so she felt that, that always had an influence on her. In 1970, she ran for Congress at age 50 and represented Greenwich Village, Little Italy, the Lower East Side, the West Side, and Chelsea. And her slogan was, "A woman's place is in the House of Representatives." And her daughter quipped, "We got her out of our house and into your house." So she was very proud of her work in Congress. In Congress, she was involved in a whole variety of causes, as you can see here. She was involved she defended the right for transparency in government. She was on the Public Works Committee. She was very a big advocate for women's rights. So they wrote the first law banning discrimination against women in credit cards, loans, and mortgages. She introduced bills regarding childcare, Social Security for homemakers, family planning, and abortion rights. She also spoke out on Soviet Jewry and spoke out against the Vietnam War. She was a big supporter of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Involved in a whole variety of issues, and very strong advocate on all of these issues. She also, like Betty Friedan, found herself struggling during the UN Decade for Women conferences. So the first one was in Mexico City in 1975. It was called the International Decade for Women's Conference, where some of the delegates began to talk about the Israeli representatives as racist and equated Zionism with colonialism and apartheid. Well, Abzug fought against this, and she pushed the American delegation to vote against the declaration that was issued at the end of this conference. And she tried hard to lobby the UN General Assembly to reject the Mexico Declaration. Unfortunately, that did not happen, and that probably paved the way for the General Assembly's resolution in November 1975, stating the notorious Zionism is racism resolution. But she strongly opposed all of that. And here's an example of Jewish women who had to struggle within the women's movement against anti-Zionism and in some cases anti-Semitic sentiment as well. She was a co-founder and president of the Women's Environmental and Development Organization, dealt with women's issues and the environment. And here's a little piece. Bella Abzug did not write a memoir, but she has some autobiographical fragments. And here's one which is an excellent piece. It's significantly longer than this, but I picked out one excerpt for you, where she says, "When I was elected to the House in 1970, I was only the second Jewish woman in the history of our nation to serve in Congress. The first was Florence Kahn. I was lonely at first, an oddity, a woman, a Jew, a New York lawyer, a feminist, a peace activist who passionately opposed American involvement in Indochina and just as strongly favored aid to democratic Israel. Sometimes I'm asked when I became a feminist, and I usually answer the day I was born. If I was born a rebel, I attribute it to my family heritage. For me, the new consciousness in the Jewish community and throughout the country was perfectly expressed the day I arranged for Rabbi Sally Priesand to deliver the opening prayer at the House of Representatives. She was the first Jewish woman to do so. She was the first woman to do so. At that moment, I felt that two movements for social progress had merged and come of age, and I really felt at home in Washington. I will say that I didn't get to meet Bella Abzug in person, but when I went to the first Jewish Women's Conference in 1973, which began sort of one of the launches of the Jewish feminist movement, she spoke, and she spoke about Jewish women in politics. So, and I certainly remember that she electrified the room. So she was a force. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there and open this up. I'm sure you have a lot of comments. Let me stop the share. Okay, and I'm just going to do this so I can see everybody. Okay, I can see you now.
So I ask a question if I can.
Sure.
So there's another American or another woman who grew up in America, who I'm wondering what her influence was on all of these Jewish women activists in the 20th century. That woman, of course, being Golda Meir. You know, and I'm wondering what interaction they had with her, or what influence they had on her or her on them. You could make a comment about that.
That's an interesting question. Okay, so the interesting thing about Golda Meir is that she, of course, broke all kinds of barriers to get to the position that she was in. But she says very explicitly in her autobiography, My Life, which is a fascinating read if you haven't read it, she says very explicitly that she did not believe in feminism or the feminist movement, because her theory was that, which was true of many women, pioneering women and women who felt who made it in a man's world. You know, her theory was that if you're a capable woman and if you set your mind to it, that you will be able to achieve whatever you want to achieve. And, you know, she was able to do it. You know, and she functioned in a very kind of tough environment with a lot of very strong male leaders. But what other people have said about Golda Meir is that she didn't recognize that for most women, there really is a need for a movement, that there really is a need for people to come together and to try to help each other to succeed. But she always said that she didn't believe in you know, in the feminist movement. And I do know that when Betty Friedan wanted to go and went to Israel to visit, Golda Meir would not meet with her because Betty Friedan was seen as a women's libber, of course. And you know, I personally think that it would have been much better for them to have met, you know, for Golda to have met with her. But I don't know what her connection, what Golda's connection was with Bella Abzug, whether they ever met. That would have made more sense because Bella was very strongly Jewishly connected, and I don't know if they ever met. But certainly Golda Meir was an important role model for all of these, for women of the 20th century, because of what she achieved. You know, there's no doubt about it. As a powerful woman, as a woman leader, but I think she, you know, many of these women would not have agreed with her, I think, on her stand on feminism, because I think they all believe that all the women we talked about tonight believe that they, even though they were very capable women, and they were able to push through and do what was necessary to succeed, that they did feel it was necessary for there to be a movement to help others to achieve their goals. So I think that there was, that there would have been differences of opinion about that. Yes, Denise.
I'm surprised that Gloria Steinem is not included tonight. Was that because of
Yeah.
time constraints or something else?
Yeah, well, I just had to pick out certain people. I mean, Gloria Steinem, of course, is a very well-known figure, and there were many others who were very prominent in the feminist movement, Jewish women. And some of them were very connected to the Jewish community, and some were not. But certainly Jewish women play, again, kind of a disproportionately large role, especially in second wave feminism. That's very well documented in the literature, both in the more moderate wings and the more radical wings. So yes, just for lack of time, I had to pick out ones that I thought were, and these are kind of interesting studies in not only in their involvement in the women's movement, but also in terms of how they thought about their Judaism. And so I picked them out for that reason. Is there another question? I saw another hand up.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
It was mentioned that Wilson was involved or supported the suffragette movement, yet he was a racist. I thought it was interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are lots of kind of contradictory aspects of Wilson, and I think, in some ways, he was a supporter of immigration in some ways, but in some ways there were, kind of counter arguments. But in terms of feminism, in terms of suffrage, he didn't come to it right away. It did take time. And Maud Nathan thought that she played a very important role in that. But I think the Wilson legacy is complicated. But you do raise an interesting point. Sarah, did you want to come?
I find it very interesting that all these women, as they were trying to advance different women's issues, how they had to fight anti-Semitism amongst themselves.
Yes.
And not much has changed, it seems. I don't know. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think this was always a struggle. We talked a little bit about Ernestine Rose tonight, and next week we're going to be talking about Jews and the civil rights struggle. And I'm going to start next week with a person, Rabbi Einhorn, who was a strong abolitionist in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. And he and Ernestine Rose were probably, there were several others, but they were among the most prominent Jewish abolitionists in the mid-19th century. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because it was very difficult in the mid-19th century as a Jew to break into abolitionist circles. And that's because the abolitionist movement had a kind of Christian evangelical tone to it. And many of the people who were abolitionists were actually made some anti-Semitic comments, although they could be friendly with particular, like William Lloyd Garrison, for example, was personally friendly. He was a very prominent abolitionist. He was personally friendly with Ernestine Rose, but he said some very anti-Semitic things, especially when he was vilifying his political opponents, like Mordechai Emanuel Noah, who was a Jewish person on the other side of the issue. So I raise this because, abolitionism and women's rights were, developed at the same time. And it was difficult for Jews to get involved in abolitionist societies, even if they were opposed to slavery, because they found it very hard as Jews to break into those circles. And the same thing with the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement had a very Christian tone to it. And I didn't give you a little bit of the background of that. I sort of mentioned it at the beginning, but I didn't give you some of the details. Some of the early presidents of the National Women's Suffrage Association said some anti-Jewish things. Basically, what they said was that much of the patriarchy and misogyny that they found in their, they didn't use the word misogyny, but most of the anti-woman sentiment that they found, that they observed in their society, they traced back to the Hebrew Bible. And they said, oh, that's the source of patriarchy. And then it just got transmitted to Christianity. And so they, not everyone, but some of the key people. So for example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we all know her name, right? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, said some things to that effect about the Hebrew Bible, and contrasted that with Christianity. And the next president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Anna Howard Shaw, also said something similar, that Judaism had a negative attitude toward women as opposed to Christianity. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is well known for having published the Woman's Bible in 1895. And if you go to the Women's Rights Museum that I mentioned in Seneca Falls, I remember seeing an excerpt from the Women's Bible on a big wall of the museum. I don't know if it's still there like that, but the Women's Bible was full of criticism of the Jewish people, of the Jewish Bible, of the kind of this textual basis of Jewish tradition. And Stanton said that this was full of contempt for women, and that later this got transmitted to other religions. So there was a lot of opposition to her Women's Bible. And in 1896, the National Women's Suffrage Association voted to reject the Bible. Now they said they rejected it because they said they were a non-sectarian organization and they weren't going to deal with, with this textual, they didn't want to endorse this her reading of the Bible, but it was also a way of repudiating, I think, some of the anti-Jewish feeling. And so there was a mixture. There were some women who came out and said these things that were anti-Jewish, and there were some people who didn't. But Jewish women always sort of felt that they had to defend themselves within the women's movement of that time. So, for example, during the suffrage campaigns in the early 20th century, some of the leading suffragists said, oh, immigrant Jews are not doing their part. Like they would, or they not Jews in particular, but they would say, oh, immigrant communities are not doing their part to support suffrage and work for suffrage. And Lillian Wall felt that she had to stand up for the immigrant communities and say, oh, yes, they are. They're not getting credit for all that they're doing on behalf of the suffrage amendment, because in fact, districts that had high Jewish populations were very strongly supportive of suffrage. And there was this kind of anti-immigrant, not only anti-Jewish, but an anti-immigrant in general sentiment in the women's movement, because some of them felt, oh, the immigrants shouldn't be getting votes first, the women should get votes. Women who have been here longer should get votes. There was kind of an anti-immigrant sentiment in some sectors of the women's movement. And the Jewish women felt they had to say, oh, we are supporting suffrage. But sometimes they would say, they felt they had to defend the fact that their organizations, they had to say, oh, our organizations, like when the National Council didn't come out in support of suffrage, some of them felt like they were on the spot. Rebecca Kohut, who we talked about last week, felt that she was put on the spot, and she had to say, well, I hope that the National Council will eventually come around to supporting it. So yes, this has been, I think, a long time feature of women, Jewish women in the women's movement, just like Jewish women in other progressive movements, where they have felt strongly about the cause, but sometimes they have felt within these movements that there's some anti-Jewish sentiment, not among everybody, but among some people within these movements. And they felt they had to defend themselves. And, you know, there are a lot of contemporary parallels. For example, the Women's March on Washington in January of 2017. We all remember what happened there, right? Where Jewish women felt very marginalized and ostracized and by the leaders of the march, right? Who were saying some very nasty things about Jewish women and about Jews. And so we see it again in our own time, where I think Jewish activists have often been in a difficult situation because they believe in the cause, but they often find that they're facing anti-Semitism there's left-wing anti-Semitism, there's right-wing anti-Semitism, and there's left-wing anti-Semitism. And often they find that they're facing some of that and they have to struggle on both fronts. And this is brought out very clearly, by the way, and Deborah Lipstadt wrote a book just a year or two ago called Anti-Semitism Here and Now. It's an excellent book. You know, everything she writes is excellent, but it's an excellent book where she discusses the anti-Semitism on the right and the anti-Semitism on the left, and how Jewish progressives often find themselves in a difficult situation where they want to support these causes, but they sometimes feel like they have to speak out as Jews. And this is not a new story, unfortunately.
So I think Lynn Liss has a question, maybe. I saw her raising her hand there.
Yes, we just wanted to make a footnote that as volunteers at the National Constitution Center, we have a new exhibit on the 19th Amendment and women's rights. And I would highly recommend it when the museum is open full time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I didn't know that. That's wonderful. Yeah, I think we are all looking forward to getting back to museums and especially the National Constitution Center. So thank you. That's great.
You're welcome.
I have a question. I was wondering what you feel the main issue is now for women to address. And I also would like to know who you think is now in the forefront of Jewish women who are activists right now.
That's an interesting question. There are lots of people. You mean specifically on women's issues or?
No, on anything political, really.
To think about that. What is the main issue? You know, I think that Bella Abzug, I mean, I really don't know what the main issue, there are so many of them. But I think that Bella Abzug was pioneering in her founding of this women's environmental organization, which still exists. And I think it was a very important organization. I gave you the name of it. WEDO is the acronym, but it's Women's Environmental and Development Organization. And I looked it up to make sure that it was still active, and it is. It was founded in 1990. And I think it's a very important organization because look, environmentalism is one of the most important issues of our time. And I think she was very prescient in realizing that this was an important women's issue too. And it was also international in scope. The idea that we should address environmental issues from a women's perspective to try to save the planet for our children and grandchildren. And I think this is an important issue for all of us today. So I would say that was, you know, that continues to be a very important issue, even more so now. And the fact that she saw it as a women's issue, I think is very interesting and important.
Thank you.
But there are many issues. And I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will address many of them, because there's already just in his cabinet appointments, we already see a commitment to bringing talented women on board and having their voices heard. I have to think about who's most prominent right now. But there are many women. I mean, there are many women who have been active in the various social justice organizations that have been founded. So Rabbi Jill Jacobs, for example, who I think I mentioned in the first session, has written, she's the head of TRUA, which is Rabbis for Human Rights. Very interesting organization, and she's written on social justice. So since that's the title of our course, I would say that she's been pretty influential as a young woman, because as a rabbi and as a young woman in discussing the Jewish roots of social activism and helping people like ourselves, in a group like this, where you could read some of her books. One of her books is There Shall Be No Needy is one of her books, and the other book is Where Justice Dwells. And both of those books are very erudite, and she goes through all of the quotes from the Torah, from the Talmud, etc. And how does our tradition pave the way for our own struggles for social activism, and why it's really incumbent upon Jews to get involved in this, but coming out of the body of their tradition. So she's a mover and shaker, but there are many, many others.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure. Anybody else? I think we're getting close to the end. Okay, does anybody have any questions or comments about the Jewish women's movement? Jewish feminist movement of the 1970s, because we didn't talk about that. Again, I had to pick and choose what I was going to talk about, so I decided to focus more outward a little bit more. But you know that the Jewish feminist movement emerged in the early 1970s, largely out of the women's movement, so there were a lot of the young women who were involved they weren't all young actually, but a lot of the women who were involved in the Jewish feminist movement were also involved in the women's movement. And they began to realize that there was a little bit of a conflict between their goals in the women's movement and the Jewish textual tradition, which, had some elements that were they were challenging for women. And so they began to challenge. And so it's really in the early 1970s that you have the development. I mean, it certainly happened before, but you have the beginnings of the development of Jewish women speaking out as Jewish women and trying to bring the consciousness of the women's movement into the Jewish community itself. So, kind of turn it inward. And that leads to eventually the ordination of women as rabbis and women cantors and more women synagogue presidents. But this is something that the early advocates for women's rights talked about. So even Rebecca Kohat, who we mentioned last week, said very early on, women should be spiritual leaders in Judaism and they should be synagogue presidents. So people were beginning to say this, much earlier, in the late 19th century. But it didn't really come about, when you think about it, there were pioneers in the late 19th century. There was a woman named Ray Frank who was functioning as a rabbi. She wasn't ordained as a rabbi, but she was functioning as a rabbi in the late 19th century. But you don't have the first woman rabbi until Sally Priesand in 1972. And that's because you really needed the women's movement to propel it forward, even though there were a few pioneering figures before that. So that's why I think Golda Meir might have been mistaken in her view that you don't need a movement, because sometimes you do need a movement to really make progress for more women, not just the few who break the barriers. So okay, well, I guess there are no more questions. Well, I think we're meeting again on Tuesday. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that will be part 4. And thank you for this very fascinating session.
Thank you. Thank
Oh,
you.
my pleasure.
We
My
enjoyed
pleasure.
it very much.
Nice to see you all, and thank you for the telling us about the exhibit at the Constitution Center. Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you. Bye.
Night, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.